Former President Donald Trump has once again ignited debate on U.S. foreign policy with bold remarks on Venezuela, suggesting that the United States could step in if the crisis-stricken nation continues its downward spiral. Speaking on the Brian Kilmeade Show, Trump framed Venezuela as a tragic example of failed leadership, wasted natural resources, and the dangers of socialism unchecked. Once one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America, Venezuela now faces economic collapse, mass migration, and political instability, conditions Trump argues demand serious international attention. Trump's comments tap into long-standing concerns about America's role in the Western Hemisphere. With Venezuela sitting on some of the largest oil reserves in the world, the stakes are not only humanitarian but strategic. Trump emphasized that under strong leadership, Venezuela could be prosperous again, hinting that U.S. involvement might restore order, protect democratic values, and counter hostile global influences already gaining ground in the region. Supporters see Trump's stance as a continuation of his America First doctrine, assertive, unapologetic, and focused on regional stability. Critics, however, warn that such rhetoric raises alarms about interventionism and could escalate tensions in an already volatile region. The idea of the U.S. stepping in prompts difficult questions. Where does moral responsibility end and political overreach begin? As Venezuela's crisis deepens and global powers watch closely, Trump's remarks have reignited a crucial conversation about power, responsibility, and America's influence abroad. Whether viewed as decisive leadership or dangerous bravado, one thing is clear. Venezuela is once again at the center of a geopolitical storm, and the world is paying attention. Former President Donald Trump has once again placed himself at the center of an international debate, this time by making bold remarks about Venezuela and the potential role of the United States in its future. Speaking on the Brian Kilmeade Show, Trump suggested that the U.S. could step in to address the deepening crisis in the South American nation. Comments that immediately sparked controversy, speculation, and renewed discussion about American power, responsibility, and influence in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela's story is one of dramatic collapse. Once considered one of Latin America's richest countries, blessed with vast oil reserves and a growing middle class, it has become a symbol of economic failure and political turmoil. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and authoritarian rule have left its economy shattered. Hyperinflation wiped out savings, basic goods became scarce, and millions of Venezuelans fled their homeland in search of survival. Trump, in his remarks, framed Venezuela not only as a humanitarian tragedy, but as a cautionary tale, one he frequently links to socialist policies and weak leadership. Trump's suggestion that the United States could step in was not presented as a detailed policy plan, but rather as a forceful statement of intent. To his supporters, it sounded like strength and clarity. They argue that Venezuela's collapse threatens regional stability, fuels illegal migration, and opens the door for rival powers such as China, Russia, and Iran to expand their influence close to U.S. borders. From this perspective, Trump's comments reflect a belief that America cannot afford to ignore chaos in its own hemisphere. The mention of Venezuela's oil wealth added another layer to the conversation. Sitting atop some of the largest proven oil reserves in the world, Venezuela represents both opportunity and risk. Trump has long argued that under competent leadership, Venezuela could be one of the richest nations on earth. His critics say this framing oversimplifies a complex crisis, but his supporters believe it highlights a painful truth. Misrule turned abundance into disaster. For them, U.S. involvement could mean restoring stability, rebuilding institutions, and ensuring energy resources do not fall under hostile control. However, Trump's words also raised immediate concerns among critics and foreign policy experts. The phrase "step in" carries heavy historical weight. For many in Latin America, U.S. intervention recalls decades of coups, covert operations, and military involvement that left lasting scars. Critics warn that even rhetorical suggestions of intervention can inflame tensions, strengthen authoritarian narratives, and undermine diplomatic efforts. They argue that Venezuela's future must ultimately be decided by Venezuelans themselves, not by Washington. The reaction to Trump's remarks reflects the broader divide over America's role in the world. Is the United States a global stabilizer with a moral obligation to act when nations collapse? Or is it a power that too often overreaches, creating unintended consequences? Trump's foreign policy record adds complexity to this debate. While he frequently used aggressive language, he also positioned himself as a president who avoided starting new wars. Supporters point to this as evidence that his comments on Venezuela are more about leverage and pressure than direct military action. Trump's appearance on the Brian Kilmeade show also comes at a time when Venezuela is once again in the international spotlight. Political negotiations have stalled, sanctions remain a point of contention, and millions of refugees continue to strain neighboring countries. The Biden administration has taken a more cautious and diplomatic approach, focusing on sanctions relief tied to political reforms. Trump's comments stand in sharp contrast, signaling a more confrontational posture should he return to power. The media response: Donald Trump's comments on Venezuela did not exist in a vacuum. Almost immediately after his appearance on the Brian Kilmeade show, reactions poured in from across the political spectrum, foreign policy circles, media outlets, and international observers. The phrase, "U.S. could step in," became the focal point of intense debate, not only because of Trump's polarizing persona, but because Venezuela represents one of the most sensitive and symbolic issues in U.S. Latin American relations. Supporters of Trump interpreted his remarks as a necessary show of strength. They argue that years of diplomatic engagement, sanctions, and negotiations have failed to bring meaningful change in Venezuela. From this viewpoint, Trump's language serves as pressure, an unmistakable signal that the United States is willing to protect its interests and push back against authoritarian regimes in its own hemisphere. To them, ambiguity is weakness, and Trump's blunt approach is precisely what has been missing from U.S. foreign policy. Critics, however, saw something far more dangerous. They warned that even vague talk of intervention risks escalating tensions, emboldening hardliners within Venezuela's government, and undermining opposition movements that already face accusations of being U.S. puppets. For these critics, Trump's rhetoric revives memories of Cold War-era interventions, when U.S. involvement in Latin America often led to long-term instability rather than democratic success. To understand why Trump's words carry such weight, one must look at history. U.S. involvement in Latin America has been marked by a complex mix of cooperation, intervention, and conflict. From Guatemala in the 1950s to Panama in the 1980s, the legacy of American interference has left deep skepticism throughout the region. Venezuela itself has long used anti-U.S. rhetoric as a political tool, portraying Washington as the ultimate external enemy. Trump's comments, critics argue, play directly into that narrative. Yet supporters counter that Venezuela's current crisis is not a product of U.S. policy alone, but of decades of internal failure. They point to the Chavez and Maduro governments, arguing that corruption, authoritarianism, and economic mismanagement destroyed a once prosperous nation. In this framing, U.S. involvement is not about domination, but about restoring stability and preventing a failed state from becoming a regional threat. Another key dimension of Trump's remarks is geopolitics. Venezuela is no longer an isolated crisis. It is part of a broader global competition. Russia and China have invested heavily in Venezuela's energy sector and provided diplomatic backing to its government. Iran has expanded cooperation as well. For many U.S. strategists, this raises alarms about hostile powers gaining a foothold close to American borders. Trump's suggestion that the U.S. could step in may reflect concern that continued inaction allows rivals to shape the region's future. Energy politics further complicate the issue. Venezuela's vast oil reserves make it strategically important, particularly at a time when global energy markets are unstable. Trump has repeatedly argued that Venezuela's resources have been squandered by bad leadership and could benefit not only Venezuelans, but global markets if managed properly. Critics respond that focusing on oil risks reducing a humanitarian crisis to a resource calculation, while supporters insist that economic reality cannot be ignored. The Biden administration's approach provides a sharp contrast. Rather than using confrontational language, it has emphasized diplomacy, targeted sanctions relief, and negotiations tied to electoral reforms. Trump's comments implicitly challenge this strategy, suggesting it is too slow, too cautious, and ultimately ineffective. This contrast underscores how Venezuela has become a political symbol in U.S. domestic politics, representing competing visions of leadership, power, and moral responsibility. Inside Venezuela, reactions were predictably divided. Government officials condemned Trump's remarks as proof of U.S. imperial ambitions, using them to rally nationalist sentiment. State media framed the comments as a threat to sovereignty. Opposition groups, however, were split. Some welcomed strong international pressure, believing it could force change. Others feared that aggressive rhetoric would justify further crackdowns and weaken their legitimacy among Venezuelans wary of foreign interference. Perhaps the most important question raised by Trump's remarks is a practical one. What does stepping in actually mean? Military intervention remains unlikely, given America's war fatigue and the enormous risks involved. More plausible interpretations include intensified sanctions, diplomatic isolation, increased support for opposition movements, or coordinated pressure with regional allies. Trump's history suggests he often uses strong language as leverage rather than a literal policy roadmap. Still, words matter, especially when spoken by a former president and potential future one. Trump's comments shape expectations, influence allies and adversaries, and signal how U.S. power might be used in the future. They also force Americans to confront uncomfortable questions about their role in the world. Should the U.S. intervene when a neighboring country collapses? Does non-intervention enable suffering and instability? Or does intervention create even greater harm? As Venezuela's crisis drags on, there are no easy answers. Trump's remarks have reignited a debate that has simmered for years, reminding audiences that the situation is unresolved and deeply consequential. This reality complicates any external response. Even the most well-intentioned intervention, military, economic, or diplomatic, carries risks. The United States, with its immense power, also carries a heavy burden of expectation. When Trump speaks about stepping in, supporters hear decisiveness. Critics hear potential disaster. Both reactions reflect an understanding that American actions, or even signals, can dramatically alter the course of events. One possible future path lies in intensified diplomatic pressure combined with regional cooperation. Latin American nations, many of which are directly affected by Venezuelan migration, have a strong interest in stability. A coordinated approach, backed by the U.S. but not dominated by it, could lend legitimacy to reform efforts. This model would avoid unilateral action while still exerting meaningful pressure. Trump's rhetoric, however, suggests skepticism toward multilateral restraint, favoring direct leverage instead. Another scenario involves economic recalibration. Sanctions have long been a central tool of U.S. policy toward Venezuela, but their effectiveness remains contested. While sanctions have constrained the government's access to resources, they have also contributed to economic hardship for ordinary citizens. Future U.S. policy, under Trump or any other leader, may hinge on whether sanctions are tightened, loosened, or restructured to directly incentivize political reforms. Here, stepping in could mean economic engineering rather than military force. There is also the question of deterrence. Trump supporters argue that strong language can prevent worse outcomes by signaling resolve. In this view, ambiguity invites exploitation by authoritarian regimes and rival global powers. Venezuela's growing ties with Russia, China, and Iran are often cited as evidence that U.S. hesitation creates space for competitors. From this angle, Trump's comments serve as a warning, not only to Caracas, but to Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran, that the Western Hemisphere is not an open playing field. Yet deterrence is a double-edged sword. strong rhetoric can harden positions, reduce room for compromise, and provoke nationalist backlash. Venezuela's leadership has historically used external threats to consolidate internal control. Any suggestion of U.S. intervention risks reinforcing that narrative, making domestic reform even more difficult. This paradox underscores one of the central tensions in foreign policy. Pressure is often necessary, but too much pressure can be counterproductive. Trump's remarks also reveal how Venezuela has become symbolic in American politics. It is not just a country in crisis, it is an argument. For Trump and his allies, Venezuela represents the failure of socialism, the dangers of weak leadership, and the consequences of ignoring regional instability. For his opponents, it represents the perils of interventionism and the importance of diplomacy and international norms. This symbolic role means that Venezuela's future is often discussed less on its own terms and more as a reflection of U.S. ideological battles. Looking ahead, much will depend on leadership, both in Washington and Caracas. A return of Trump to the White House would almost certainly bring a shift in tone and tactics. His past presidency showed a willingness to apply maximum pressure while avoiding direct military conflict. Whether that balance could be maintained in a second term remains an open question. Meanwhile, Venezuela's leadership faces mounting internal and external pressures that cannot be indefinitely managed through repression alone. For the Venezuelan people, the stakes are existential. Millions remain displaced, families divided, and basic services unreliable. International debates about sovereignty and strategy often feel distant from daily struggles for food, medicine, and safety. Any discussion of the U.S. stepping in must ultimately confront this human dimension. Power politics may shape decisions, but humanitarian realities will judge their outcomes. Trump's comments, controversial as they are, have achieved one undeniable result. They have forced attention back onto a crisis that the world has grown accustomed to overlooking. In an era defined by competing global emergencies, Venezuela risks becoming background noise. By reintroducing the possibility of decisive U.S. action, real or rhetorical, Trump has disrupted that complacency. As this conversation continues, one truth remains clear. There are no simple solutions. Venezuela's crisis is the product of internal failures and external pressures, historical legacies, and present-day choices. The United States cannot fix it alone, but it also cannot pretend it has no influence. Whether through diplomacy, economic policy, or strategic signaling, America's role will remain significant. In the end, the question is not only whether the U.S. could step in, but whether it knows how and when to step back. The future of Venezuela and the credibility of American leadership may depend on finding that balance. The crisis in Venezuela is no longer a distant headline. It is a defining test of leadership, responsibility, and global accountability. As powerful voices once again raise the possibility of U.S. involvement, the world must decide whether to remain passive observers or active participants in shaping a more stable future. Silence and inaction have consequences, and history shows that ignoring collapse only allows suffering to deepen. This moment calls for awareness, engagement, and informed discussion. Stay informed about what is happening in Venezuela beyond political soundbites. Question the narratives, examine the facts, and understand the human cost behind every policy decision.